Well, welcome everyone to another session of the 15th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Ailes. I'm your moderator. Uh, we have with us today uh, Dr. Laura Morrow, an assistant and associate professor of business management, and also the assistant director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Lipscomb University. And we also have with us Julia Osteen, who's the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning and an assistant professor of education, also at Lipscomb University. And you can see the title for this session is Equity-Minded Course Design to Enhance Student Learning Outcomes. So let me turn it over to Laura first. All yours.
Thank you so much. We are so glad that you chose to come to this session today. And we are excited to bring you some information just to show you a little bit about what we have going on. And Bob, you did a great job with the introduction, so I won't reintroduce us for the sake of time and leave more time for our discussion and things like that. But just for an agenda, we're going to start off and talk a little bit about some psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm going to share a small one faculty member experience of a time when I did not get it right. And so we'll start there, and then we'll look a little bit about some definitions about trauma and equity mindedness, and then move into some educational equity principles and some mind shifts that we can make in order to help our students maximize their learning and how those can translate into the student learning outcomes. We're really going to spend a good bit of our time today on some tools, and the primary tool that Dr. Osteen will go through is David Rock's SCARF model that's rooted in neuroscience. And then we'll also explore some other resources as we have time. In case we don't have time to get to all the other resources, we have prepared a Google Doc for you with links to resources that we will put in the chat when the time is right. So those will be coming your way, so don't worry about that. You'll have access to those when you need them, and then we will save some time for questions at the end. So as we begin, I need to make a really important disclosure that neither of us are physicians, neither of us are licensed medical providers. We have observations and experience. We have done a lot of reading, we've researched, we have an education and a social science background. My dissertation happened to be workplace stress. So I have looked into stress and stress responses from a social science perspective, but we are not physicians or licensed medical providers. So as we talk about trauma and some trauma responses, just know that that we're coming to it from not a clinical background, but more of a social science education, observation, and reading background. And what we're learning is what we're going to share with you today. So as we start, I just want to give a quick reminder of something that finds its way, a theory that finds its way in many classes across campuses, in high schools and at universities, and that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is a great little motivational theory in psychology, rooted in psychology, that I always taught in my principles of management or organizational behavior class. And I will tell you from a faculty member experience, I'm going to kind of tell you what I would say when I got to this model in class. I would say, okay, we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've probably seen it before. And because they were usually juniors that I would teach this to. And I would say, you know, according to Maslow, there are basic needs that we all have. Physiological needs like food, water, shelter, rest, those types of things. And then we have, if those needs are met, then we can be motivated by security needs or safety needs. And we go kind of up the pyramid, right? So when the lower order needs are met, we are then able to be motivated by higher order needs. And I used to say something like, This theory is really is lovely, but it's not really very helpful because most of us have these lower order needs met. And so it's really, while there's some helpful information here, we don't really get to use the whole theory, and therefore it's probably not a great theory. Several years ago, I kind of had this aha moment in my own experience of how, first of all, blind that was to what students in my class very well may likely be experiencing. And it happened because I had some international students from a developing country who needed to stay with me, with our family. And they stayed with our family for a few weeks. And we noticed that they didn't turn their lights off when they went to bed at night. They kept their lights on all night long. And, you know, I would wake up in the morning and I'd realize the lights never went off. And did you ladies have, you know, were y'all up late? Were you studying? And we talked about it and we talked about it. And throughout the several weeks that they were staying with us, at one point, one of them mentioned, well, we just needed to tell you, we're not comfortable turning off the lights because bad things happened in the dark when we grew up. And so I had this aha moment and this moment of embarrassment that I have people sitting in my class with so much trauma in their history that they don't have the security of being able to turn the lights out at night in order to get good rest. And having research stress, I know that rest is really important. And so then all of a sudden I had these moments. And so now when I teach this, I tell my students, I used to say this, and now I'm realizing that was wrong. And now I'm teaching it like this. So I wanted to just kind of open up with that story of my own experience, of one person's experience of how what I'm starting to learn in this area. So if this information is new to you, you are right there with me. And I've studied stress for the better part of 15 years. So I will also say, and we are very fortunate here at Lipscomb. We've had Elandria Lewis of United Way of Middle Tennessee come and do some sessions with us on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And she gave us permission to share this with you today. But she has helped us to understand that, you know, and I think this is a similar way of looking at that same type of concept, where if we have folks that are sort of having questions about their safety, they're not able to get those executive learning, or we're not, if we have questions about our own safety, we're not able to really learn new things because we're really still trying to get those safety and physiological needs met lower down in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I think there's a really interesting connection here that I've recently had a lot of light bulbs going off. Elandria also shared with us that she likes to use this little survival, emotional, and executive state graph that you see at the bottom of this slide as a check-in sometimes for students, especially as in workshops and meetings, of a check-in of where you don't have to say anything out loud, but where are you today as you approach some new material? Because we're about to learn new things. And where are you today? Are you having kind of a lower, is it a day where you didn't get very much rest last night? For us here in the Nashville area, we had storms all throughout the night, and I have a dog who does not do well with storms. And so all night long was next to the side of my bed, right? Those types of things can impact what we're capable of learning. And so I thought this was another tool similar to Maslow's to really kind of start thinking about, wow, what happens and what's going on in our minds and our bodies really can impact or limit our ability to learn new things. So let's think for a moment, and we've all probably seen things like this Post-it note that, you know, in similar memes or similar sharings on, you know, social media or posters in the hallway or on bulletin boards of "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." So I wanted to take a minute and think through, just spend about 30 seconds and think about have there been experiences that as faculty, as members of an education community, where you've had a moment where you learned a student of yours had experienced some trauma? Okay. And so I'm gonna give you a moment to just think about that. I'm gonna do about 30 seconds and have you think about that. You will not have to put those moments in the chat, or you won't be asked to share traumas that your students have shared with you, anything like that. You will not have to do that. But what I will ask you, the next slide will just be how did you learn of those traumas? And I have a multiple choice little Slido for us. So you'll have the opportunity to kind of share how you learned, but in a very confidential, very anonymous way, actually, more than confidential. But think about, what are those experiences that you've had with your students where you've been made aware of trauma that they've had in their life? About 10 more seconds. All right. Well, as you're thinking about those, I have a little, you can use the QR code here, or you can go to slido.com and put in this code. But if you have your phone on you and you can take a picture, how have your students shared trauma experiences with you? And if you're not sure, because you don't know if the students have shared them with you yet, that's okay. And you may realize over the courses as we continue to talk about this and define some things that you may have had some experiences you weren't familiar or aware of, but we wanted to kind of get a sense of where folks are. And you can choose more than one answer. Okay. I'm gonna give a few more minutes, or a few more seconds, rather. Starting to see some different results here. I'm going to move all of our faces out of the way so I can see where we are. All right, we have about 7 responses, so a good number of folks. And it looks like, as you might imagine, you might suspect that most of the time for folks, this is happening either during office hours or conversations outside of class, similar to that conversation that the students had with me, or communication related to an assignment. I'm not going to be able to turn this assignment in on time because this is going on in my life, or whatever. I also see about 43% reflective writing, several in a class discussion, either in person or online. And some may have shared in a different way. What's very interesting to me is that no one in this group who participated isn't sure. We've all been aware. Oh, and those late work assignments, or the communication related to assignment, has just popped up a little bit. So all of us are aware that students are experiencing or have experienced trauma in our classrooms. As we move forward to the next slide here, I think I skipped one. Hang on just a second. Oh, you know what? I did skip one ahead of time. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to do this in reverse. I must have been happy with my little clicker here. But so we're all familiar with trauma. Since I'm defining it after we've prepped you for it, let me just tell you that the definition here by Vinay in her equity, in the equity-centered trauma-informed education book is this idea that trauma can be either an individual response. Somebody had a response as an individual, such as an illness, such as an abuse, something that was dangerous, or something that caused that stress in this harmful condition, or it could be collective. And a really good example of this would be COVID. I'm not sure how anybody could have navigated through, and people may have been able to, but many of us experienced some kind of trauma from the whole experience of COVID. And I would imagine if there's 10 of us in this room, there are 10 different ways that that manifested. Some people, it could have been a fear for life. Some people, it could have been financial. And some people, it could have been extra things you had to deal with because maybe you were worried about family members, or you had children at home and you were trying to do your job and be a teacher for young children. All kinds of different ways that could have manifested itself and ultimately yielded trauma, right? So for those who develop a trauma response, the impact can be intense, it can be pervasive, disruptive, affecting both the mind and the body. Interestingly enough, in this book, Vinay talks about or references that half to 3/4 of all children will experience some sort of traumatic event before the age of 18. So half to 3/4 of our classes have had something in their past, either as a child or currently, that has been trauma that's impacting them. And maybe they've been able to go through and get healing from that, but some of them haven't been able to. One thing to consider, not all stress is trauma. So not all stress is trauma can be a very normal response to stress, extreme stress. And then not all trauma ends up as PTSD. So those are some letters that we hear a lot, those post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a specific set of symptoms identified by a psychologist. So we're not really talking about those, but we're talking about just anything that can be experienced by our students. And then that collective or individual response that could be intense or pervasive or disruptive. All right, let's see if my little thing will go through. Okay, now what is it? What are we talking about when we're talking about equity mindedness? Because that's what we want to really focus in on, knowing that we have this reality that folks have been through traumatic experiences. And we want to start looking about equity and what can we do in the classroom that can really help with the learning and help bring our students to the ability to have those more executive thinking, those executive states of good learning, right? So USC in their Center for Urban Education defines equity mindedness, and I went ahead and did a screenshot because this is one of the references that we've included is the link to this. So I wanted you to see exactly what you'll see when you go to this website. The term equity mindedness refers to the perspective or mode of thinking exhibited by practitioners, us, right, who call attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. So these practitioners are willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of their students and critically assess their own practices. It also requires that practitioners are race conscious and aware of social and historical context of exclusionary practices in American higher education. I suspect that if you're here today, you're probably starting to think about, or well in your way to thinking about, what can I do personally, but also how can I help my institution, as we're really looking at how to provide more equitable opportunities for our students. I've already referenced this book once, but this book right here is a wonderful resource identifying some principles of really what equity-centered education looks like. So principles of, if there's equity-centered education, it is anti-racist, it's anti-oppressive, it's asset-based, meaning we don't assume that people need to be fixed if they've experienced trauma, right? as I mentioned before, trauma is a very normal response to stress and a stressful situation. So folks don't need to be fixed by us in the classroom, right? So what we can do is we can use the talents, the skills, the capabilities of the people that we have. And sometimes the stress responses and trauma can actually bring really beautiful gifts that can be brought to the classroom. They're very systems oriented. So not just in your class, but really a holistic approach for what's going on campus, very human centered, very universal and proactive. So it's not just this, okay, I found out somebody in my class is struggling with something, what can I do? But really a proactive approach as you're putting the syllabus together at the beginning of the semester, thinking through what are some supports I can give to all of my students. Right? And then a social justice focused as well. In this book, the author also talks about these 4 shifts that we need to make from more of that reactive to the proactive I've already mentioned. The savior mentality that we can fix the students to no, we're going to use what the students are bringing to class with them, and we're going to have a more beautiful experience because of what's brought to class, right? Responsibility of individual teachers, that's not necessarily only on individual teachers, but we can share the burden. And then how trauma affects our classroom, instead of like, man, there's trauma that's been experienced by students in my class, so how is this going to impact how we're learning and what we're learning, to okay, what happens in my class that we can use to then impact the world. Right? So those are kind of 4 shifts that were really helpful as I started really learning more about this and figuring out some things to do in class. What I want to spend a couple minutes, so tell us a time, and I will say we had a presenter do a session for some of our faculty this last week on accommodations in class, right? And what our executive director of our Office of Access said, she was like, there was a time where I was like, I knew I was going to have to do something because I had a student who needed an accommodation. But what I realized was when I put that accommodation in class for everyone to use, all the students did better, right? So I'll give you a quick example as you're thinking. So one example for me was I decided I was teaching online asynchronous, and I had a lot of students during COVID who were teaching kids at home. They were working their jobs, and they were single parents, right? And so with my deadlines for class, instead of having my deadlines at 11:59 p.m., I changed my deadlines to 8 a.m. the next morning to give 8 additional hours for everyone, because I'm not a night owl. I go to bed, but I wake up early, right? And the students are sometimes needing that time after the kids go to bed. It's the first time it's been quiet in their whole house all day long. And so to realize I have folks that are balancing all this all day long, and they might need a minute before they start their homework for the evening or before they get to whatever they need to do for school. And they can take the time after the house is quiet to kind of have that calming moment before they take a quiz or before they take a test. So that is something that I did in my class just to try, that then I realized, oh, this is helping everybody. Because I realized there was this 8-hour block when people weren't, nobody was looking at assignment. I wasn't grading it, and they weren't able to work on it unless it was late. And so just extending that to 8 a.m. Opened up that time when nobody was working on an assignment, that then people could, if they needed to, submit assignments after the house got quiet during COVID. So that's an example for me. So tell us about a time and go ahead and write in the chat about some times where maybe you did something in class and it ended up with maybe a student in mind, but it ended up helping the whole. And I'm going to stop the share for a minute so I can see our chat better here. Anything yet? Oh, I love it. Study guide worksheets for every week. Kind of those study guides to help set and help prioritize. Blanket extensions. Absolutely. Captions for videos. 100%. Help a student walk through the search process for a project during office hours, and then created a demo video to add to the project instructions. That's fantastic. Yes. Discussion post with an option for a video post, not just text-based. Fantastic. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and share our screen again. Those are wonderful. Keep them coming if you can, if you want to, if you have other ideas. All right. Well, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Julia Osteen, and she's going to spend a little bit of time talking about one of our favorite tools, David Rock's SCARF model.
All right, thank you, Laura. So I love talking about this particular model. David Rock, for those of you who are not familiar, is one of the founders of the Neuro Leadership Institute. And they have a lot of really great programming. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's not. But there's a lot of good information that comes from that group. And while David Rock is not a neuroscientist himself, he has studied the research of neuroscientists. And he put together this model that helps us to understand human behavior. And so this model is, of course, is an acronym because we need more acronyms in our world. But this is one that's actually fairly easy to remember because it spells SCARF. And those 5 letters are the 5 domains of his model. Now, what David Rock says is that our brains act in much the same way to a social threat as they do to a physical threat. So just the phrase, "Can I give you some feedback?" elicits the same chemical reaction in your brain as hearing footsteps behind you in the dark. And so if we really think about that, just really take that in and think about that, then we can understand that when we talk about psychological safety, social safety, those are very real things. And so these 5 domains are domains that when we attend to them can help to activate the reward response in the brain and minimize the threat response in the brain. So the first domain is status, and this is relative importance to others. So that means it's what I think you think about me. It's not what you actually think about me. It's what I think you think about me. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Status is can be very important to people. It also can be very easy to harm. And so when we think of status, when we think of our students and how we're designing courses, we think about how have I honored what they're bringing to the table? How have I put things together so that they are understand that what they're bringing is important as well. The second one is certainty. And this is a need for clear expectations. Our brain craves predictability. So if you go anywhere on a regular basis and it's a place where you gather with other people, you're likely to sit in a very similar spot. And why is that? Well, that's because it's predictable and our brains just naturally go to that. Maybe at your place of work, you have a very similar place where you park every day. And so these are just very real manifestations of this idea of certainty. Clarity helps to provide certainty. So as we think about our students and we're designing our courses, how have we really set our courses up to provide as much certainty as possible to our students. One of the things that comes to mind that's a really good resource in that way is the Transparency in Learning and Teaching Framework. And if you don't know that framework, that's a really great resource. You can just Google it and it'll bring it up. And it has a lot of great examples of how you can provide certainty through transparency for students. The next domain is autonomy. This is a sense of control or a need for choice. So when we look at our course design, how have we been able to provide autonomy to our students? Now, you can't always give students choices on things because you have a certain amount of content you have to cover and all that. That's very important. However, within that, how can you incorporate some student choice so that you're providing for some autonomy? Relatedness is that sense of belonging, is a sense of safety, that need to feel a part of a group. When we take the steps to really develop a learning community, we're really building that relatedness piece within this. And then the last one is fairness. And this is much like the status we were talking about, in that it's not actually what is fair, it's the perception of fair exchanges. So it's, how do students perceive things are fair? Do they perceive things are fair? Or do they perceive that they're not fair? Again, transparency helps with this as well. You can't be 100% transparent with students often. There'll be things you won't be able to share because of confidentiality issues. But what can you be transparent with? And again, the Transparency in Learning and Teaching Framework I find really helps with that a lot. All right, so our next slide. We want you to think about this as when you think about applying that framework of SCARF, the status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. What's one way that occurs to you that you could apply one of those concepts in your class today, or this week, or next week? So go ahead and put that in the chat. Those clear instructions, you know, that's really something, because I will work really hard on something and I'm thinking, oh, this is crystal clear, everybody's going to understand it. And lo and behold, there's an interpretation of it that I just never even occurred to me. And so, like, I feel like I'm constantly working on that. The rubrics really help to, absolutely really help to communicate what we see as quality within student work, for sure. Yes, and provide certainty. Thank you for that. All right, well, I hope we've given you some things to think about in regard to this idea of SCARF that's connected to neuroscience research. And I think Laura is going to talk now about some other tools.
Yes, and I do apologize for taking it off the PowerPoint. For whatever reason, my computer is not cooperating with me, so I'm not able to see the chat at the same time as the presentation. So sorry about that. I'm going to put a document into the chat right now, and this is going to be a document of resources that I promised you earlier. And I also, as you're having a chance to pull that up, and I'll pull our presentation back up here too, and we'll have some pictures to go along with the things that you're looking at in the Google Doc. Or actually, let me just share the Google Doc. Let's do that. and then we can go through because it's the exact same information. So I will move to that real quick. We have some information for you about this whole idea of the conscious discipline brain state model that I shared earlier. We have the link to that for you. Some more information on trauma-informed education if this is new to you. So these are two good resources as far as websites to go. That equity mindedness concept I shared earlier in the description. And then also, as Julia mentioned, the David Rock Scarf model, which if you think about, okay, how is that helpful? You know, you will remember that some of the things that you did for accommodations could be some of those same things that help to provide some autonomy. I know one of you mentioned having blanket extensions. That absolutely provides some autonomy for students as far as when they can turn things in, and allows them to be able to do it in a way where they don't have to tell you why. And I will tell you, I'm doing some research right now on cancer and stigma in the workplace. And one of the things that we're learning qualitatively is folks don't always want to have to tell you what they're going through, why they're going through it, and why they might need an extension. So to be able to just say, I'm going to need an extension on something, and they know they'll have it, can be really helpful. I'm also was just, as Julia was speaking, just having some thoughts, some of those thoughts just about, you know, as kids, sometimes when kids don't have control over something, of course, that's when they act out. So going through those trauma experiences and having moments in your life where you're just like, I can't do anything about having to go through this. But if you have another area of your life where you can have some control, like the way you're able to do an assignment, for example, if that's an option for you to share some of the authority for how to put together an assignment, even that is why that connects and helps students to have a more equitable experience in your class. And then also there are two additional books that are favorites of ours, favorites of mine for sure. And this first one is The Learning That Matters, a field guide to course design for transformative education. There've been a couple of times throughout this where there's been mention of, in order to have equity-minded courses, equity mindedness, this idea of being willing to look at your information, to be willing to look at your courses and really give them an objective look as, is this something that's equitable or is it not? And there's a wonderful list of questions or statements in this Learning That Matters book that has things like, I don't provide time to learn from mistakes. I spend more time and energy identifying what's wrong with students and their work rather than what's right. You know, things like that. There's a whole list of about 10 different bullets that you can really think about in your own classes and think through, am I doing that? Do I provide time to look over how we got things wrong, why we got things wrong, and how to learn from those things in my class? If I'm not, then maybe there's room in this. And I will tell you, it's a very humbling exercise, but it's also an exercise that walking through this, I've personally had a lot of aha moments of, much like the one I shared with you at the beginning of this presentation of, wow, that I could have done that differently. I was not realizing, and by saying things that I was saying in class completely unintentionally, I was alienating people that were sitting there in my classroom, knowing that I don't feel safe, or I didn't get good rest, or I have legitimate concerns where my lunch is coming from right after this class is over. Right. And so I hope that could be helpful for you. There's another book as well, What Inclusive Instructors Do. You may be familiar with it. You likely already are, but if you're not, it's a wonderful book. A great thing. It's a wonderful resource book, but it's also a place with evidence. So a couple of times, again, as we mentioned, it's really important not to just be like, well, my gut is, but really collecting evidence why the things you're doing in class are work, right? And this book is one of those that have 4 key lessons, like in order to be an inclusive instructor, people take responsibility for making their teaching and their curriculum inclusive. People continue to learn about both their students and their teaching. They care about for each and every student they teach, and they change their teaching based on evidence and practices that support and challenge all students to thrive. And one thing that I particularly liked about this is in this book, there's a get to know you, who's in your class, little template that you could use to ask students to collect information from them about, help me get to know you as your professor. So I know who's in the room. So I know what kind of examples to provide. So I know what, if there's a support that I didn't realize I might need to think about, is there a way to get to know students ahead of the time at the beginning of the semester? So that is what we have planned for you today. Do we have questions? We have a few minutes for questions.
Laura, I did just now add the link to the Transparency in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education framework, if
Yes.
anyone wants to look at that further.
Saw that. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Okay, this is a great question. Do you find that students are open and honest when you ask them to tell about themselves? Yes, in some instances, and no in other instances. One thing that I will say I think helps is, and this is Dr. Cynthia Albee, who you may know. She's one of the authors of the Learning That Matters. And I've gotten a chance to get to know her. And one thing that she encouraged a group of us to do was to do a welcome letter to students, where you really start and tell them a little bit about yourself before class even starts. And so when I found that I've done that, and then even include like the tell me a little bit about yourself in a response back, they are more open. And in fact, I've gotten some emails from students saying, I'm a first generation student. I haven't been in school in 10 years. I was super nervous, but I got that welcome letter from you, and it really made me feel like I was going to be able to succeed in class. And I don't know that they would have shared that in a tell me about yourself kind of little template, right? So I think that how it's presented, of course, helps to ensure or helps to encourage how much folks do share. Do you have anything else on that, Julia?
I would just add, I have had students who are shy of sharing about themselves at first. They really need to know you're in their corner before they will share with you. And so the development of that relationship over time is super important. And that once you establish that relationship with them, then they will open up and tell you things that you like, I have been blown away. Like, I had no idea this was what you were dealing with. So sometimes it's later in the semester after you've known them for a while.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say too, I've definitely done, I don't know if I've had the privilege a couple of times over my career to teach students in more of like a cohort type style. And so by the time we get to like that 4th class, we can do something a little bit more vulnerable together in class. But even then, I've done things where, I've said, hey, let's get to know each other. What questions do folks have that they want to hear from the class? So they weren't necessarily posed to a person. In fact, we did this one time. And again, I teach management stuff and teamwork and things like that. And it was the 4th time I had a group, a small group of women at a women's college. And we opened it up where they could put anonymous questions about race, things that they had always been curious about, but they didn't know or that they could ask, or they weren't sure they could ask. And so they were able to anonymously ask questions. And then I read them and kind of moderated the conversation. And it was a beautiful way to start learning more about students and learning. And we laughed because, you know, people would say things. There was questions about hair, and there was questions about, do you prefer the term Black, or do you prefer the term African American? And we laughed because half the group said, I prefer Black, and half the group said, I prefer African American. And we were like, well, we're confused. Help us understand, help us know more. And so sometimes there's like a magical time where you get synergy in a class and you can really start having even those types of conversations, and setting them up in ways that are safe. They really do share and open up in ways that I never imagined they would in class. And we have one person who wants to know about SCARF. There is so much great information about the SCARF model on that Neuro Leadership Institute website, which we put the link to. We also included a link of how SCARF can be used as a motivational tool in the workplace. So there's an academic kind of application article about SCARF as well. So I think there's a lot that's that you can dive through and look in that. But feel free to send us an email if you have questions as well. Our email is on that resources link.
Yeah, that was funny, but I was thinking about that too, how I'm an instructional designer and how we can apply it at my students as well as the workplace. I say, well, that might work good as well. Thank you.
Yes. We have a colleague who told us that she has SCARF, the word SCARF, written and posted in her office right next to her phone, so she can remember as she's having those conversations with folks, like, oh yeah, if I need to remember these things even in casual conversation. So you're right spot on there, Eugene. Thank you. All right. Well, I think our time is about up. We are very thankful you were here today. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for wonderful questions. We really appreciate it.
And in return, we appreciate both of you sharing all that good information with us. So it's just about lunchtime here. Oh, I'm going to lunch. I wish I could go to Pancake Pantry, but I can't. No, they don't deliver either. So too bad. Anyway, thank you again.